The morning sun cast long shadows across the private airport terminal as Dr. Sarah Bennett's black Mercedes pulled up to the entrance. Her watch showed 6:45 a.m., exactly 1 hour before her scheduled flight to Boston, where a critical patient awaited her expertise. She had made this trip many times before, but today would be different. Sarah checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting her crisp white collar beneath her navy blazer. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned every bit of her success. Her natural hair was styled in neat, professional braids, and her face wore minimal makeup. She had never been one for unnecessary fuss. Another day, another life to save, she whispered to herself, a ritual that had started during her residency years ago. Grabbing her leather briefcase and small carry-on, she stepped out of the car. The early morning air felt cool against her skin as her heels clicked purposefully across the parking lot. The private terminal stood apart from the main airport, a glass and steel structure that catered to executives, celebrities, and medical professionals like herself who needed to travel on short notice. Sarah had been using this terminal for the past 5 years, ever since she became head of neurosurgery at Memorial Hospital. The hospital's executive travel program had arranged everything, just as they always did. As she approached the entrance, Sarah mentally reviewed the case waiting for her in Boston. A 14-year-old boy with a rare brain tumor, the kind of challenge that had drawn her to neurosurgery in the first place. His local doctors had called her specifically, knowing her reputation for handling complex cases. The surgery couldn't wait. Every hour mattered. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Inside, the terminal was quietly busy with early morning travelers. A group of white executives in expensive suits stood near the coffee station, chatting about market projections. A famous actor she recognized from TV sat in a corner, hiding behind sunglasses. The familiar faces of the regular staff, Janet at the check-in counter, Mike the baggage handler, and Tom the coffee shop owner, went about their usual routines. Sarah reached into her briefcase, pulling out her identification and flight documentation. Everything was in perfect order, as always. Her hospital ID badge gleamed under the terminal's soft lighting. The words, Dr. Sarah Bennett, Chief of Neurosurgery, clearly visible alongside her photograph. The flight details showed her name as the primary passenger on the private jet chartered by Memorial Hospital. She noticed a new face at the security checkpoint, a guard she hadn't seen before. Something about his stance made her pause for a fraction of a second. In 15 years of medicine, she had developed a sixth sense for trouble, the same instinct that helped her anticipate complications in surgery before they happened. The guard's eyes followed her as she approached, his expression changing subtly. Sarah recognized that look. She had seen it before, though rarely so openly in professional settings. It was the look of someone who had already made assumptions, whose worldview was about to collide with a reality they weren't prepared to accept. Still, she maintained her usual warm, professional smile. Her mother had taught her long ago that dignity was not just about how others treated you, but how you carried yourself in the face of their treatment. As she walked toward the security checkpoint, Sarah stood tall, her credentials ready, her manner confident but approachable. Behind her, the terminal doors opened again as more passengers arrived. The morning sun streamed in, casting her shadow ahead of her on the polished floor. In that moment, she was simply Dr. Sarah Bennett, a surgeon on her way to save a young boy's life. She had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would turn this routine morning into something that would change not just her day, but the lives of many others. The security guard straightened up as she got closer, his hand already rising in a stopping gesture before she had even reached the checkpoint. Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself of what was at stake, a young patient waiting for her skills, a family counting on her expertise, and a principle that was bigger than any single moment of confrontation. Little did anyone in that quiet terminal know, they were about to witness a masterclass in handling discrimination with grace, dignity, and strategic brilliance. The events that would unfold over the next hour would become a story told in diversity training sessions and professional seminars for years to come. The story of how one woman's composed response to bigotry created lasting change. Security guard Richard Mills stood at his post, watching Dr. Bennett approach. His 6 months at the private terminal had taught him what their kind of clients looked like, or so he thought. He lifted his hand in a stopping motion, his face set in what he considered his professional expression. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, emphasizing the word ma'am in a way that stripped it of all respect. "This is a private terminal. The main passenger entrance is in the other building. His voice carried across the quiet space, causing several heads to turn. Dr. Bennett stopped precisely at the security line, her expression calm. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and measured. "I'm Dr. Sarah Bennett. I have a flight scheduled for 7:45. She held out her credentials, including her hospital ID, pilot's clearance, and flight documentation. Mills barely glanced at the papers. "We'll need additional verification," he said, ignoring the confused looks from his coworkers. Janet, the check-in clerk who had known Dr. Bennett for years, started to stand up from her desk. Just then, another passenger walked up, a white businessman in an expensive suit. Mills nodded him through with barely a glance at his ID. The contrast was striking, and several onlookers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Of course, Dr. Bennett replied smoothly. She opened her briefcase and produced her medical license, hospital executive travel program card, and passport. "I believe these should help verify my identity and flight status." Mills picked up the documents, making a show of examining each one with exaggerated care. "These seem unusual," he said, though everything was clearly in order. "Are you sure you're not confused about your flight arrangements?" The famous actor in the corner had removed his sunglasses, watching the scene with growing concern. Tom, the coffee shop owner, had stopped wiping his counter, his cleaning cloth frozen in mid-motion. "I'm quite certain," Dr. Bennett responded, her voice remaining professional. "I've been flying from this terminal for 5 years now. I have an emergency surgery scheduled in Boston this morning. A 14-year-old boy is waiting for me." Mills's face tightened. "Well, you understand we have to be careful. This is a high-security area for specific clients." He emphasized the word specific while looking pointedly at her simple but elegant business attire, as if suggesting it must be fake. Dr. Bennett noted Janet now walking toward them, paperwork in hand. She also saw Mike, the baggage handler, speaking quietly into his radio. The terminal's atmosphere had changed, the morning quiet replaced by a tension you could almost touch. "I understand security concerns completely," Dr. Bennett said, maintaining eye contact with Mills. "In my operating room, we also follow strict protocols. The difference is, we apply them equally to everyone." The businessman who had been waved through earlier stopped his walk to the private jet area, turning to watch. His face showed a mix of embarrassment and concern as he realized what was happening. Mills shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the growing attention. "I'll need to call this in," he said, reaching for his radio. His hand trembled slightly, the first crack in his authoritative facade. "Please do," Dr. Bennett replied. She took out her phone, her movements unhurried. "And while you do that, I'll be calling the terminal management office. I'll also need to inform my hospital's legal department that their chief of neurosurgery is being delayed without cause. I'm sure they'll be very interested in reviewing the security footage of this interaction." She gestured to the cameras mounted in the ceiling corners, her expression still professionally pleasant. Several other passengers had pulled out their phones, some recording, others apparently sending messages about what they were witnessing. The morning sun had risen higher now, streaming through the terminal's glass walls. It illuminated Dr. Bennett as she stood straight and dignified, a perfect picture of professional composure in the face of prejudice. The light also showed the sweat beginning to form on Mills's forehead as he realized the situation was quickly spinning beyond his control. What had started as a routine security check had become something else entirely, a moment that would soon transform not just one guard's attitude, but an entire institution's approach to equality and professionalism. The next few minutes in the terminal felt like hours. Dr. Bennett's phone call to management had set things in motion, but Mills wasn't backing down. Instead, he seemed determined to dig himself deeper into the hole he'd created. "Ma'am," he said, his voice getting louder, "I don't care what kind of doctor you claim to be. This terminal is for legitimate private jet clients." He waved her documentation in the air as if it were meaningless paper. "Anyone can print fancy IDs these days." Janet from the check-in counter could stay quiet no longer. "Richard, Dr. Bennett is one of our regular." "Stay out of this, Janet," Mills snapped, cutting her off. "I'm handling security here." His face had turned red, and his hands were shaking more visibly now. Dr. Bennett calmly took out her tablet and opened her medical credentials app. "Perhaps this will help," she said, pulling up her profile on the American Board of Neurological Surgery website. Her photograph and credentials were clearly displayed, along with her hospital affiliation and list of achievements. You can scan the QR code to verify its authenticity. Mills ignored the tablet, instead pointing to the private jet area. Look around you. Do you really think you belong here? His voice dripped with meaning, making it clear exactly what he was implying. The terminal had gone completely silent. The famous actor had stood up, phone in hand, openly recording now. The businessman who'd been waved through earlier approached the security desk. "Excuse me," the businessman said. "I've seen Dr. Bennett at medical conferences. She's keynoted several events. This is ridiculous." But Mills was too far gone to listen. "Sir, please step back. This is a security matter." He turned back to Dr. Bennett. "For all we know, you could be trying to get access to one of our real clients. Maybe you're trying to get close to him." He gestured toward the famous actor. Dr. Bennett's expression remained composed, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Let me be very clear," she said, her voice carrying across the terminal with quiet authority. "I am the chief of neurosurgery at Memorial Hospital. Right now, a 14-year-old boy named Tommy Chen is being prepped for emergency surgery in Boston. His parents are waiting at the hospital, hoping their son's tumor can be removed before it causes permanent damage. Every minute you delay me puts his life at greater risk." She held up her phone. "I have the hospital administrator, our legal team, and terminal management all on conference call. They can hear everything you're saying. The security cameras are recording everything you're doing. And based on the phones I see around us, this incident is probably already on social media." Mills's face went from red to pale. Behind him, the terminal doors opened, and 3 people in management suits walked in quickly, led by the terminal director, Mr. Thompson. But Mills made one last desperate attempt. "This is a restricted area," he said, his voice rising. "These jets cost thousands of dollars per hour. There's no way you could afford." Actually, a new voice cut in. "Dr. Bennett's flight today costs exactly $23,450. Captain James Walker, her regular pilot, had emerged from the jet bridge. I know because I've flown her to Boston at least 20 times in the past year alone, usually for emergency surgeries just like today." The terminal director reached the security desk, slightly out of breath. "Dr. Bennett, I cannot apologize enough." Mills interrupted him. "Mr. Thompson, I'm just following security protocols. You always said to be extra vigilant about unauthorized access." "Unauthorized?" Dr. Bennett's voice was still calm, but it now carried an edge of steel. She turned to face the growing crowd of staff, passengers, and management. "Would anyone here like to explain exactly what makes my access look unauthorized? My multiple forms of ID? My regular flight history? My professional credentials? Or is there perhaps some other factor influencing this, extra vigilance?" The silence that followed her question was deafening. Mills opened his mouth, then closed it again, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, illuminating a scene that would soon become a turning point, not just for one prejudiced guard, but for an entire institution's approach to equality. Terminal Director Thompson looked at the security footage playing on his tablet, his face growing more concerned with each passing second. The morning's events played out in crisp, clear video, every discriminatory word and action captured perfectly by the terminal's high-definition cameras. "Dr. Bennett," he said, looking up from the screen, "I assure you, this is not how we train our staff to behave." His voice carried genuine distress. "We can have you on your way to Boston immediately." But Dr. Bennett wasn't finished. She had already missed her original takeoff time, and she intended to make this moment count. Taking out her own tablet, she pulled up her calendar. "Mr. Thompson," she said calmly, "I'd like to schedule a meeting for next week. Not to file complaints, though those will come from our legal department, but to discuss solutions." She looked around the terminal, including everyone in her gaze. This isn't just about one incident or one person. Mills stood frozen at his security post, watching his career seemingly crumble before his eyes. The famous actor had walked over to join the group, removing his sunglasses completely. "I've got 3 million followers on social media," the actor said, holding up his phone. "Say the word, Dr. Bennett, and this goes viral in minutes. People should know how you were treated." Dr. Bennett raised her hand. That won't be necessary, she said firmly. Public shaming rarely creates lasting change. What we need is something more constructive. She turned back to Thompson. How many of your staff have received proper diversity and bias training? The terminal director shifted uncomfortably. We have basic training modules. Online videos that nobody watches, Janet added from behind the check-in counter, her voice carrying years of frustrated observation. Dr. Bennett nodded. Memorial Hospital has one of the best diversity and inclusion programs in the country. We train doctors, nurses, and staff to handle patients from all backgrounds with equal respect. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'm offering to have our team help you develop a real training program. The businessman who had spoken up earlier stepped forward. I'm on the hospital's board of directors, he said. We'd be happy to assist with this initiative. He handed Thompson his business card. Captain Walker checked his watch. Dr. Bennett, we can still make it to Boston on time if we leave now. I've already updated the flight plan. She nodded, but turned to face Mills one last time. The security guard seemed to have aged years in the past hour, his earlier arrogance replaced by a look of dawning understanding. Mr. Mills, she said, her voice firm but not unkind, you have a choice to make. You can let this incident define your career, or you can be part of the solution. She gestured to Thompson. If you're willing to learn and change, I recommend keeping him on the team. Sometimes our biggest mistakes become our best opportunities for growth. Thompson looked surprised but thoughtful. Mills swallowed hard, his eyes showing the first genuine emotion beyond fear, a glimmer of shame mixed with hope. I don't deserve a second chance, he stammered, looking at the floor. Maybe not, Dr. Bennett replied. But my job is saving lives and fixing problems. Sometimes that means cutting out the bad parts, but often it means rehabilitation and recovery. She picked up her briefcase. The choice is yours. As she walked toward the jet bridge, accompanied by Captain Walker, the terminal burst into spontaneous applause. But Dr. Bennett barely noticed. Her mind was already in Boston, focusing on young Tommy Chen and the delicate surgery ahead. Send me the training schedule when it's ready, she called back to Thompson. And Mr. Mills? The guard looked up. Pay attention in those classes. The next Dr. Bennett who walks through those doors might not be as patient. The morning sun had risen fully now, streaming through the terminal windows and casting long shadows behind her as she walked to her plane. In her wake, she left not just an important lesson about dignity and professionalism, but a seed of real institutional change that would grow into something far more significant than one morning's confrontation. The next 2 hours at the private terminal were unlike anything the staff had seen before. After Dr. Bennett's departure, the quiet morning erupted into a flurry of activity. Terminal Director Thompson hadn't even made it back to his office when his phone started ringing. Yes, sir, he said, speaking to the airport CEO. The videos are already in my inbox. No, sir, this isn't good for us at all. He wiped sweat from his forehead as he listened. Actually, Dr. Bennett proposed a solution that might help us avoid a PR nightmare. In the main terminal area, the famous actor was talking to his agent. No, I don't want this on social media, he insisted, surprising everyone around him. You should have seen how she handled it. Dr. Bennett's way is better. Get me in touch with the hospital's foundation instead. I want to support their diversity training program. Janet at the check-in counter was busy pulling up Dr. Bennett's flight history. 5 years of perfect records, over 60 emergency flights, and not a single complaint or incident. She printed everything, highlighting the dates and times. Each page showed what Mills should have known. Dr. Bennett wasn't just a regular client. She was one of their most respected passengers. Mills sat in Thompson's office, his security badge on the desk in front of him. His hands were shaking as he watched the security footage of himself. The camera angle showed everything in painful clarity, his dismissive gestures, his aggressive stance, the way he waved others through while blocking Dr. Bennett. I didn't realize how it looked, he said quietly, watching his recorded self become more and more agitated while Dr. Bennett remained professional. I thought I was just being thorough. Thompson paused the video. Being thorough means checking everyone's credentials properly, Richard. What you did. He pointed to the screen. That wasn't security. That was prejudice, plain and simple. Are you firing me? Mills asked, his voice small. Thompson leaned back in his chair. Dr. Bennett suggested we shouldn't. She thinks you can learn from this. He pulled out the business card the hospital board member had given him. But if you stay, things will be different. Very different. In the break room, Mike the baggage handler was showing other staff members something on his phone. Look at this, he said. Dr. Bennett's hospital has been rated top in the country for staff diversity programs 3 years running. They train people from all over the world. He looked up at his colleagues. We're lucky she's willing to help us instead of sue us. Captain Walker, having ensured Dr. Bennett's safe departure, was filing his flight report. He added a special note. Passenger delayed by inappropriate security screening. Passenger showed exceptional professionalism in response. Recommend formal appreciation and review of security protocols. The businessman who'd spoken up earlier was in the terminal's conference room with Thompson, already sketching out plans on a whiteboard. We'll need to revamp your entire training system, he said. Dr. Bennett's right. Those online modules aren't enough. We need real, in-person training with concrete examples. Outside at the security desk, a new guard had taken Mills's place. Janet walked over to brief him. See these credentials? She said, showing him Dr. Bennett's file. This is what a legitimate high-level client looks like. They don't all fit one profile. That's the whole point we need to learn. By noon, Thompson had drafted a formal apology letter, but it wasn't just addressed to Dr. Bennett. It was a public statement acknowledging the need for systemic change. He read it aloud to his staff. Today's incident showed us that having rules isn't enough. We need to ensure they're applied fairly and professionally to everyone. We are committed to making meaningful changes. In Boston, unaware of all this activity, Dr. Bennett was already in surgery, focused entirely on saving young Tommy's life. She didn't know that her composed response to discrimination had set off a chain reaction, one that would reach far beyond a single morning at a private terminal. The morning sun had climbed high in the sky, and in its light, an entire institution was beginning to look at itself differently, all because one woman had chosen to turn a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for transformation. 1 week later, Richard Mills sat in Memorial Hospital's training center, his new notebook open and ready. He wasn't alone. The entire terminal security team was there, along with staff from other airport departments who had asked to join after hearing about the incident. Dr. Michelle Rodriguez, head of the hospital's diversity training program, stood at the front of the room. Today's session isn't about making you feel guilty, she began, looking directly at Mills. It's about understanding how our unconscious biases affect our actions and learning to do better. On the screen behind her, security footage from the incident played silently. Mills forced himself to watch, though his face burned with shame. This time, he saw what everyone else had seen, not a security guard doing his job, but a man letting his prejudices override his professionalism. Mr. Mills, Dr. Rodriguez said kindly, would you share with the group what you see in this footage? Mills stood up slowly, his hands gripping the desk for support. I see myself not being a professional, he said, his voice shaky but clear. I see myself treating Dr. Bennett differently than other passengers. I see racism in action, and I was the one doing it. The room was silent, but not with judgment. Many heads nodded in understanding. Terminal Director Thompson, sitting in the back, wrote something in his notebook. That's a brave admission, Dr. Rodriguez said. Now, let's talk about how we identify these biases before they become actions. Throughout the morning, the group worked through real scenarios. They practiced checking credentials properly, learned about different types of professional documentation, and most importantly, discussed how to maintain consistent standards for everyone. During the lunch break, Mills sat alone until Janet from the check-in counter joined him. You know, she said, setting down her coffee, Dr. Bennett called yesterday to check on how the training was going. Mills looked up in surprise. She did? Janet nodded. She wanted to make sure you were included, not pushed out. Said something about how changing one person's perspective can change many others down the line. Back in the training room, Dr. Rodriguez pulled up new images on the screen. Successful professionals from all backgrounds. Your job in security is important, she said. But security doesn't mean assuming the worst about people who don't fit your preconceptions. Mills raised his hand. Can I say something? When Dr. Rodriguez nodded, he stood again, facing his colleagues. "I've been doing this job for 6 months, thinking I was protecting our clients. But last week, I was the biggest threat to our terminal's reputation. I almost cost us our relationship with a respected doctor in her hospital. I want to learn how to do better." Thompson spoke up from the back. "That's why we're all here, Richard. Dr. Bennett showed us that real security comes from treating everyone with respect while being thorough and professional." After the session, Mills stayed behind to help stack chairs. Dr. Rodriguez approached him with a folder. "Dr. Bennett asked me to give you this," she said. Inside was a letter, handwritten on Memorial Hospital stationery. "Mr. Mills, I wanted you to know that Tommy Chen's surgery was successful. While the morning's delay was unfortunate, it reminded me why I became a doctor, to help create positive change, one person at a time. Your willingness to learn and grow shows courage. Remember that feeling when you meet the next person who doesn't fit your expectations. They might be another surgeon, or a CEO, or someone else who will surprise you. Dr. Sarah Bennett." Mills carefully folded the letter and put it in his notebook. Tomorrow, he would return to his post at the terminal, not as the same person who had confronted Dr. Bennett, but as someone who understood that true security meant protecting everyone's dignity while doing his job. The afternoon sun slanted through the training room windows, casting long shadows that looked different to Mills now. In just 1 week, his world had shifted, not because he'd been punished, but because someone had chosen to turn his mistake into an opportunity for growth. As he walked out of Memorial Hospital, he carried with him not just a certificate of completion, but a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly serve and protect all people equally. 3 months after the incident, the private terminal had changed in ways both visible and invisible. The physical space looked the same: gleaming floors, comfortable waiting areas, and large windows letting in natural light, but the atmosphere was noticeably different. At the security desk, Mills checked a passenger's credentials with careful attention. "Good morning, Dr. Patel," he said, examining her documentation with professional thoroughness. "I see you're headed to Chicago today." His tone was the same as it had been with the previous 3 passengers: respectful, efficient, and completely neutral. Dr. Patel, a heart surgeon who had begun using the terminal recently, smiled as she collected her papers. "The other doctors at the conference were right," she said to Janet at the check-in counter. "This is the most professional private terminal in the region now." Janet beamed with pride. The terminal's reputation had grown over the past months, but not because of the incident with Dr. Bennett. Instead, they had become known for their exceptional standard of service, equal, professional, and respectful to everyone. Terminal Director Thompson sat in his office, reviewing the quarterly reports. Passenger satisfaction scores had risen by 40%. More importantly, their client base had become more diverse, with an increasing number of medical professionals, business leaders, and executives from all backgrounds choosing their terminal. The famous actor who had witnessed the incident walked in, now a regular client. "Hey, Richard," he called to Mills. "Caught your interview on that airport security training video. Pretty powerful stuff." Mills nodded modestly. The video of him sharing his story had become part of a nationwide airport security training program. "If my experience can help other security officers avoid making the same mistakes, then something good came from it," he said. In the break room, new security officers watched the training video during their orientation. On screen, Mills spoke honestly about his transformation. "I thought I knew what our clients looked like," his recorded self said. "But I was really just carrying around prejudices that hurt people and made me worse at my job. Real security means being thorough and professional with everyone, no exceptions." The terminal's new training program, developed with help from Memorial Hospital, had become a model for other airports. Thompson had presented it at an international aviation security conference, where it received significant attention. Janet walked into Thompson's office with more good news. "Dr. Bennett's story just won the Healthcare Leadership Award," she announced. The article about how she handled the situation and helped create institutional change is being published in several major medical journals. Thompson picked up a framed article from his wall. The headline read, "From Confrontation to Transformation: How One Doctor's Response to Discrimination Changed Airport Security Training." "Have we confirmed her flight for next week?" he asked. "Yes," Janet replied. "She's doing another emergency surgery in Boston. Richard specifically asked to be on duty that day, Says he wants to show her how much things have changed. Outside at the security desk, Mills finished his shift handover to the next guard. Remember, he said, every passenger deserves the same professional treatment. We're here to ensure safety, not make judgments. As he gathered his things to leave, he paused to straighten the new sign posted at every security station. Our commitment to professional excellence. We maintain consistent standards for all passengers. We respect every client's dignity. We prioritize both security and respect. We recognize excellence comes in all forms. Mills smiled, remembering how different things had been just 3 months ago. His phone buzzed with a message. The airport director wanted him to help train security teams at other terminals. His story of change had become a powerful teaching tool. The afternoon sun streamed through the terminal windows, catching the frame of another new edition, a plaque commemorating the terminal's recent award for excellence in professional security services. Below it hung a simple quote: "Real change begins when we choose to learn from our mistakes and help others do the same." Dr. Sarah Bennett. As Mills walked to his car, he reflected on how one morning's incident had transformed not just his own perspective, but an entire institution's approach to security and respect. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes start with one person choosing dignity over anger and education over punishment. 6 months to the day after the incident, Dr. Sarah Bennett walked into the private terminal for another emergency flight to Boston. The early morning sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, just as it had on that memorable day. This time, everything was different. Richard Mills stood at his post, professional and alert. As Dr. Bennett approached, he gave her the same respectful nod he gave every passenger. "Good morning, Dr. Bennett. Emergency surgery in Boston today." "Yes," she replied, presenting her credentials with a warm smile. "Another young patient waiting." Mills checked her documentation thoroughly but efficiently, no more and no less carefully than he did for everyone else. "Everything's in order. Captain Walker is already preparing the jet." As she walked toward the gate, Dr. Bennett noticed the changes around the terminal. New signs promoting diversity and professionalism adorned the walls. The security staff, more diverse now, moved with confident professionalism. Every passenger received the same level of thorough but respectful screening. Janet waved from the check-in counter. "Dr. Bennett, did you see the article about our training program in Aviation Security Monthly?" "I did," Dr. Bennett said, pausing. "I heard you've had visitors from airports around the country coming to learn from your example." Terminal Director Thompson emerged from his office, carrying a plaque. "Dr. Bennett, I'm glad I caught you." He held up the award. "We won Most Improved Private Terminal in the national rankings." The judges specifically mentioned our new approach to professional security and equal treatment. The famous actor, arriving for his own flight, stopped to shake her hand. "Doctor, your story inspired me to start a foundation," he said. "We're funding diversity training programs at smaller airports across the country, already seeing amazing results." A young security trainee approached Mills. "Sir, could you help me understand something about credential verification?" she asked. Mills excused himself to assist her, treating the teaching moment with the same seriousness he now brought to all aspects of his job. Dr. Bennett watched the interaction with satisfaction. The seed of change she had planted had grown into something far more significant than she had imagined. The terminal had become a model of how to balance security with respect, professionalism with humanity. As she waited for her flight, she overheard a conversation between two passengers, a young black woman in a business suit and an older white executive. "I always choose this terminal now," the woman was saying. "They're thorough but professional. No assumptions, no different treatment. Just good security done right." The executive nodded. "I've been flying private for 20 years. These folks have set a new standard. Other terminals are starting to copy their methods." Captain Walker appeared at the gate. "Ready for takeoff, Dr. Bennett?" As she gathered her things, Mills stepped away from the trainee to speak to her one last time. "Dr. Bennett, I never properly thanked you," he said quietly. "You could have ended my career that day. Instead, you helped me become better at my job and a better person." Dr. Bennett adjusted her briefcase strap. "Mr. Mills, I'm a surgeon. I don't believe in simply cutting things out if they can be healed. Sometimes the hardest cases have the best outcomes." She looked around the terminal. and sometimes one successful treatment leads to curing many others. As she walked toward her plane, the morning sun streamed through the windows, casting her shadow ahead of her just as it had 6 months ago. But this time, it fell across a changed landscape, one where professionalism, respect, and equal treatment had become the standard, not the exception. Inside the plane, as Captain Walker prepared for takeoff, Dr. Bennett looked back at the terminal. The simple moment of choosing dignity over anger, education over punishment, and transformation over retribution had created waves of change that continued to spread. "Ready for takeoff, Doctor?" Captain Walker asked. "Yes," she said, turning toward the future with a smile. "There's always another life to save, another change to make, another lesson to teach. That's how progress happens. One person, one moment, one choice at a time." The jet lifted into the morning sky, leaving behind a terminal forever changed by one woman's decision to transform a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for lasting change. In the end, the greatest lesson wasn't just about security protocols or professional training. It was about the power of choosing dignity, wisdom, and growth in the face of discrimination.